So Kate and I are sharing this session. I'm Alistair Kirkbride. I've been a freelance transport consultant for about the last 22 years or something, working on the sustainable transport side of such things. I've done all sorts of bits of work, like for Northwest England, on what a carbon reduced transport system would look like. I also recently, with Action for Communities in Cumbria, set up a new charity, the Cumbria Mobility Network, working with County Council and their excellent community transport team and other volunteer networks, and trying to bridge through to more innovative transport work as well, just to see how we can stir that to get more interesting stuff happening. Kate, would you like to introduce yourself, even though we might not be able to see you?
Hopefully you can see me now. I don't know, can you see me? Anyway, I'm Kate Willshaw. I am a policy officer at Friends of the Lake District. Friends of the Lake District is part of CPRE nationally, and we were basically concerned with the environment. So it's everything from like the beautiful landscape of Cumbria in the Lake District, right the way through to tranquility and how people can use the landscape and climate change. And obviously transport really does fall within this, because there's an issue with climate change, and climate change is damaging the landscape, but there's also an issue with people's ability to enjoy the landscape and to actually, have a nice time within the landscape if they're stuck in a traffic jam, or if they're actually unable to access the landscape because they don't have a car. So we're sort of like, we've fallen into doing transport because people kept saying to us, well, why aren't you doing anything about transport? So in 2019, we held a conference about what is the future for transport in rural areas. And we had speakers from all over the country and also from Europe, where they've actually got some really interesting sustainable transport stuff going on in very, very rural areas. So that's why I'm actually here, because I've sort of taken on a transport brief over the last 2 years. I'll hand back to Alistair.
All right, aware of time, I think we need to get maybe a basic fact here is that, the UK has to be compliant with the Paris Agreement in terms of carbon reduction. And if we boil that down to what it means to transport, we have to reduce carbon emissions from transport by about 14% per year for the next 30 years. Now, carbon emissions from transport have been going up year on year, so it's already going the wrong way. Now, 14% per year is quite a lot, and it's far more than maybe a bit more bus use here, or maybe let's try and encourage some people to cycle. We have to fundamentally rethink how people get round. And I'm not saying that as it's all going to be awful. So the first of my 3 key points, I suppose, tonight is what we need is a really clear vision and picture for what a sufficiently decarbonised transport system would look like for Cumbria. So Councillor Little's absolutely right. Cumbria is, well, both a fantastic place and a really varied place. So how this will play out in the different parts of Cumbria will be very different. But we can point to all sorts of places around the UK, but also around the world, that demonstrate what it could be like. And it could be brilliant. It could be really, really good. I would challenge anyone to not want what the package of measures would look like for where they live and their lives. But my first point, therefore, is but we need to understand clearly what those packages look like. What does our transport life look like in a decarbonised world? And until we are able to articulate that clearly, it's really going to be really difficult to make sure that those things are priorities. Now, we've already experienced some of these things. We don't think that when we're walking through a pedestrianised area in a city or a town that we're actually experiencing low carbon transport. Or maybe it's a bad example. If you get on a shuttle bus from an airport to a hotel, remember those times we used to go on holiday overseas and things like that. That is high quality, efficient, sustainable transport. Most of those, but not a lot, a lot of those buses are electric now. These are the sorts, we've already experienced these things. We just need to understand clearly what they mean for the different types of places in Cumbria. Kate, shall I hand back to you before my second point?
Yeah, I've got a point, which is basically, at the moment we're in a situation where it's one of those things of like, I wouldn't start from here if I was you. There's that old story, and basically what we need to do is actually look at a vision for how we want a low carbon transport system in the county. So one of the things that really puzzles me is the fact that, as Councillor Little said, buses have to wash their face. They have to actually pay for themselves. You can't run bus services if they're not actually fundamentally in the black all the time. So this makes me wonder, we spend an awful lot on roads. We spend an awful lot on roads. The county council spends on roads, the highways agency spends on roads, but they don't have to be, they don't have to wash their face. They don't have to be in the black all the time. So we're getting free, not free roads, but the roads are paid for by the authorities, whereas the bus services have to be paid for by the passengers or they don't happen. So one of the things that I really want to know is, how can we turn this on its head? How can we sort of take some of the value out of the roads that are paid for private cars, which are very highly polluting at the moment, and actually turn it into a much better public transport system, you know, a system which is really flexible, a system that has small buses running for all the communities within the county, a free bus service. You know, why are roads paid for and bus services aren't, and train services aren't as well? That's one of the fundamental questions that we actually need to look at turning on its head. We need to actually take the value out of private cars and put it into a better low carbon sustainable transport system, you know, like Alistair spoke about.
And I think there are lots and lots of examples that we can point to around the world. We don't have to make all this up from scratch. It's the businesses in Tallinn. And now, I've never been to Tallinn, but the businesses in Tallinn were the ones that were campaigning for free bus services for everyone in the city centre, for the economic vitality of that city centre. And I can list hundreds of examples of really good rural transport that work well. They're not all overseas. We often talk about, you know, how brilliant Switzerland is, but it's expensive, or how brilliant North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany is for rural bus services. I observed people, I was once paid to stand at a bus stop in Denmark years ago and watch who comes and gets on the buses and what they do. It's eye-wateringly brilliant when you see when services work properly. But because they're such good services, people use them, so they become economically viable. And so the challenge is not just to kind of scratch our heads and work out who's going to pay for it. It's to turn the system around so that we have integrated, high quality transport services that people want to use because they work for them and their lifestyles. So this whole problem of, but they're not commercially viable, kind of starts to go away. We need to flip the system, but it is possible to do that. We don't have to look too far away. There are really good things happening in the UK. Cornwall took control of quite a lot of its transport in a fairly contentious way, it has to be said. It's the first rural area that started taking on the sorts of powers that London has, and increasingly places like Manchester has, to show that it can be done outside the big urban areas. There's a couple of operators in South Wales. There's a company called Via Van who have been knitting together all these disparate small transport services into a much more coherent, integrated set of services, so that it's just simpler and so it works for a lot of people. People don't have to work everything out from scratch. I could go on. I've worked a lot on car share schemes and bike share schemes. So, you know, there will be a car in your village or town or neighborhood or whatever that you can book and use when you want to, take back and walk away from it and get a bill at the end of the month. Networks of electric bikes are the future, according to most people that know about rural transport, because most people in rural areas go the sorts of journeys that they're perfectly attuned for. And before people say, oh, well, that won't work for me, there's a really important point. It's not everything, it's not everywhere, and it's not all the time. So it's not my great aunt Mildred will never get on an electric bike. There will be other services that fit that. But for a lot of people, a lot of time, and in a lot of places, most of these services would accommodate an awful lot of people's travel needs. And so we have to go with what's possible, not do anything because it might not apply to everyone.
Just to let you know, you've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, back to Kate, go on.
Okay, well, what I would say is that all of these things that Alistair has talked about are absolutely necessary. We need all of these things put together, but what we actually need more is we need someone with the oversight of this, someone who has the authority to take charge of all of these fragmented ideas, all of these fragmented ways of travel. So I imagine most people haven't actually heard about the transport that Councillor Little was talking about in the south of the county. It's an absolutely amazing transport setup, but the rest of the county probably hasn't heard about it. So what we need is either the county council or some other body to come along and basically say, right, we're going to put in place a plan, we're going to look to the future, and this is what we want the outcomes to be, and we are going to drive this forward, because it can't be left to individuals, and it can't actually even be left to individual companies. It needs some coordination, it needs some oversight, it needs something like Transport for London. We need Transport for Cumbria, to be quite honest, because we have so many really odd issues. So just like Alistair was talking about Cornwall, we have 42 million visitors that come to Cumbria every year, and 87% of them travel here by car. So we've got to deal with not just our population, we have to deal with all of the people that are coming here and needing to use our roads, and they are using our roads in their cars, and that's because there isn't actually the transport available for other modes, other ways of actually using transport. So without actually some oversight, without a plan, this isn't going to happen, and things are just going to carry on as normal. The bus services are still going to be like, well, if it doesn't pay for itself, it's not going to be viable, and people are just going to carry on using their cars, and people that don't really have the money are going to end up having to buy cars and use them because they can't actually do anything else, and it takes a huge chunk out of their own personal finances. So
I think it's important to say as well, 24% of the population of Copeland, it's almost exactly the national average, don't have access to a car. So this isn't being anti-car, this is being pro-access. And I think that's a really important point that we tend to forget about. Shall I finish off, Kate?
Yeah, finish off, Alistair.
Yeah, okay. I think there's a couple of really important points though, that we kind of might not recognize. Firstly, when people see and experience what we would call low carbon transport systems, people really, really, really like it. And I think the challenge there, well, the opportunity therefore, is to allow people in Cumbria to recognise what low carbon transport would look like for them. And that then allows people to understand clearly what the implications are for their own lives and their own types of places and the places that they live. Secondly, is just final summing ups, apart from the fact that about a quarter of the population don't have access to a car in their household, that's increasing. And there's loads and loads of evidence now that young people, so especially young adults, people up to 35 years old, are in increasing numbers not getting driving licenses for all sorts of reasons, but quite a lot of these people don't want to be wedded to a car. In my era, getting a driving license was a rite of passage. These days, it's getting whatever the next phone is and being on social media. Social norms have fundamentally changed, and it's kind of up to us to design systems for the generation of people. They access things using their phones rather than traveling to places to go and get things. And this is becoming really, this is a massive opportunity to start catering for that. And my very final point is, carbon reduced transport systems end up delivering on all sorts of other outcomes. So air quality is really good in low carbon transport systems as well. People's health, people are generally healthier, partly because they walk and cycle more, but partly due to a reduced emissions generally. Social isolation reduces due to better access and accessibility. It's a fairer system, so more people can have access to opportunities and services that they need. And also, places where this is done become more prosperous economically, and there's more of the money that would otherwise go into transport finds its way back into the local economy. So we can lead on carbon reduction because we have to, but it actually ticks an awful lot of other policy boxes as well. I've turned into a campaigner. I didn't mean to, but hopefully I've been trying to set out some of the ideas about what low carbon transport might look like.